Ethics in tax accounting. Definition: tax accountants have several responsibilities to the public, through the government. The responsibility of the tax accountant is not for a fraud in a tax liability, and as an attester, a tax liability is a statement or declaration of sanctions for fraud, and information from the result of presenting financial statements is true and complete. The Statements on Standards for Tax Service. The Statements on Standards for Tax Service are general ethical considerations that underlie the standards made by the Tax Executive Committee of the AKJ, whose interpretation replaces the SRTP. And its interpretation since October 1, 2000. The Statements on Standards for Tax Service. 1. Tax return positions. 2. Answers to questions on returns. 3. Certain procedural aspects of preparing returns. 4. Use of estimates. 5. Departure from a position previously in an administrative proceeding or court decision. 6. Knowledge of error, return preparation and administrative proceedings. 7. Form and content AF advice to taxpayers. Statement on Standards for Tax Service. Number 1. Tax return positions. This standard addresses a member's obligations when recommending tax return positions or preparing or signing tax returns filed with any taxing authority. Statement on Standards for Tax Service. Number 2. Answers to question on returns. This standard addresses a member's obligation when signing the preparer's declaration on tax return if a question on the return has not been answered. Statement on Standards for Tax Service. Number 3. Certain procedural aspects of preparing returns. This standard addresses a member's obligation to examine or verify information related to another taxpayer when preparing a taxpayer's return. Statement on Standards for Tax Service. Number 4. Use of estimates. This standard addresses a member obligation when using the taxpayer's estimates in the preparation of a tax return. Statement on Standards for Tax Service. Number 5. Departure from a position previously concluded in an administrative proceeding or court decision. This standard addresses a member's obligation in a tax return position departing from the position determined in an administrative proceeding or court decision. Statement on Standards for Tax Service. Number 6. Knowledge of error, return preparation and administrative proceedings. This standard addresses a member's obligation when there is knowledge of an error in a taxpayer's return or related tax matters. Statement on Standards for Tax Service. Number 7. Form and content of advice to taxpayers. This standard addresses a member's obligation concerning certain aspects of providing advice to a taxpayer. Ethics of accountants in the taxation. Statements on Standards for Tax Services are general ethical considerations that underlie the standards made by the Tax Executive Committee of the AKJ, whose interpretation replaces the SRTP and its interpretation since October 1, 2000. What is interesting is the opening sentence. Standards of practice are the scope of self-declaration as a professional. Members must fulfill their responsibilities as professionals by advocating and maintaining standards against which their professional performance can be measured. In such cases, the best indication of the ethical standards that a tax accountant can meet can be found in those standards. There are 6 standards shown in the SSDS, namely, 1. A tax accountant may not suggest a position unless there is a realistic possibility for sustainable good. 2. A tax accountant may not make or sign a return if this is in a position that is not recommended under point 1. 3. A tax accountant may suggest a position which he thinks is not reckless as long as it can be disclosed. 4. A tax accountant is obligated to advise clients on potential penalties in several positions, and suggest disclosures. 5. A tax accountant must not suggest a position that exploits the IRS audit selection process or 6. It is forbidden to act only in a position of refuting. According to this standard, it is unethical to capitulate a client's request to reduce the client's actual tax liability, because when you sign a return, you are certifying that the return is true, correct, and complete. If you sign it means you are involved in a lie. Responsibilities on tax. Tax accountants have several responsibilities to the public, through the government. The tax accountant's responsibility is not for a fraud in a tax liability. A tax liability is a statement or declaration of sanctions for fraud related to taxation, as well as information from the results of the presentation of financial statements is true and complete. In the AKJ's financial statements of the Responsibility Tax Preparers, SRTP, in the tax liability positions 5.05 and 5.06. 5.05 A tax self-assessment system can function effectively if taxpayers report their results on a tax liability correctly, correct, and complete it. A tax liability is a taxpayer's report of facts, and the taxpayer has final responsibility for positions receiving returns. 5.06 CPAs establishes the form of excise duty on the tax system as well as on their clients. The strong position is that the taxpayer is under no obligation to pay more tax than is legally owed, and the CPA has an excise duty on the client to assist in achieving the target. The IRS argues that the primary responsibility of the tax practitioner is the tax system. The IRS Commission, Roscoe Egger in Armstrong, 1993-85, states that a good and strong tax system does not only consist of tax administration entities, in this case the IRS. It should also consist of Congress, the administration, and the community of practitioners. Not as separate parts of the wider community, but rather working together towards a common goal. The Director of IRS Practice, Leslie Shapiro in Armstrong, 1993-85, further emphasizes that, while it is generally agreed that tax practitioners have an obligation to the ability, loyalty and confidentiality of clients, this is also called the practitioner's responsibility for a good tax system. The final responsibility is the importance of pervasiveness. In a normal practitioner-client relationship, both responsibilities are recognized and carried out. However, this situation is difficult. In some situations the practitioner is required to decide on applicable obligations, and in practice it can be concluded that the obligations of the tax system are the highest. The IRS relies on the tax practitioner to assist in administering tax laws honestly and fairly in service and developing client confidence in the integrity and compliance of the system tax.